Hello, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to the 11 o'clock session, which is panel 7. And we have our first speaker, who is Cameron Calvin Farrar, who is a senior in sociology and political science. He's a double major with a minor in rhetoric and public advocacy at UNCG, Greensboro. Cameron is currently a student in the Lloyd International Honors College, and at this time at UNCG has been the recipient of the Spartan of Promise Award, a student peer educator for the Office of Intercultural Engagement, and a Democracy Fellow for the Office of Leadership in Civic Engagement. So Cameron, I turn it over to you, including giving them the title of your piece. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. My name is Cameron Farrar, and we will be talking about today the plight of racialized capitalism and what it means, particularly what it does and what it looks like. So first, I want to start with a quote from Angela Davis. I believe profoundly that the possibilities of democracy but they need to be emancipated from capitalism. As long as we inhabit a capitalist democracy, a future of racial equality, gender equality, and economic equality will elude us. So what is racial capitalism? So the concept is used oftentimes in social sciences, particularly in sociology, as a means of addressing capitalism's inherently racialized capacity. And we'll, again, going to talk about a bit of what this means, but essentially what that means is how race plays into how we operate a capitalist system and how that impacts individuals in that system through the American lens, of course. So how does it affect Black and Indigenous and people of color? So the exploitation of Black laborers and laborers of color, the low percentages of home ownership, and we're going to talk about how this affects people economically and also socially, the underfunded public schools that having low home ownership is a product of, and also the constant microaggressions and undermining of the contributions and intentions of Black and Indigenous people of color. So what this looks like in regards to the exploitation of Black laborers and laborers of color is you start to see a shift. So at the end of enslavement, you see a shift to Reconstruction. And Reconstruction, in some cases, being successful, like the Freedmen's Bureau, and having systems in place that were actually economically helping these newly freed, formerly enslaved people. But you start to see a rollback in that, because at this time of Reconstruction, you also have people working as sharecroppers, individuals who are not really seeing a transition out of enslavement, but a transition of enslavement. And this is not something that is contributing to the Black economic growth, but a hindrance, because it's a way to not pay Black laborers. And so you see also with this transition from enslavement is the transition of language. So you also will then start to see, well, the 13th Amendment does free people, but there's also the clause of incarceration. And so you see the labor of incarcerated people, even today, working for pennies and nickels and dimes an hour. And that is somehow constitutional because of this clause. And of course, you see wage theft, which in this case is discussed as losing wages that you agreed to, not in the context of you have, you're being underpaid, right? This is different. In the context of this report, it's specifically wages that you were expected to receive, but don't receive. And then we also have, of course, the racial wage gap, which is the gap that I was just referring to, which is the pay difference depending on the intersection of race and gender that you find yourself at. And so separate and unequal, which is stolen opportunity. And so stolen opportunity is a big portion of racial capitalism. This is actually a map of the city of Greensboro here. And you can see it's been redlined. And the areas where it is red is where predominantly Black people stay. And the redlining process is the discriminatory patterns of disinvesting and obstructive lending practices that overwhelmingly impact homeownership for Black Americans. And you see with the GI Bill, and you see even today, so little amount of, even on the previous side, right, of seeing Black opportunities for homeownership, which is an opportunity for wealth. I mean, there are studies that show even owning your home, there's a correlation in the amount of health you have and things of that nature, right? And so in not owning your home, because, right, our schools are funded by property taxes, you see that you have schools that are grossly underfunded, and you don't have government funding that's making up that gap. So prior to integration, which is another thing I want to talk about, there's a large, robust population of teachers of color in these segregated schools, and they don't make their ways into integrated schools. We see an integration of students, right, into previously majority white schools, or majority or white only schools, but we're not accepting teachers of color. And economically, that impacts the Black community. But also, you have these teachers who are either taking a pay cut or having to find new opportunities in the 60s and 70s because they can't find work in the classroom any longer. And of course, this is also a product or a reflection of the achievement gap. We start to see students of color doing not great academically in compared to their white counterparts. And so what this does is, if I can show that, okay, we don't have, the academic success, so then you're not able to partake in more rigorous or academically driven opportunities later. It's a form of sabotaging students before they even have an opportunity based on the area code that they live in. And I also want to mention the intersectional experiences of inequality in terms of women identifying people, right? Because when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about money. This system on the basis of race and of gender is not showing favoritism to anyone, particularly, but the white male identifying person. And this is particularly important because if we're going to have a system of opportunity and of equal opportunity where you can make that transition between class, this isn't a way to go about it. And it's certainly not something that we've seen before within this system. And I also think with racialized capitalism, the importance is the reproduction of inequality. You've seen that I've talked about things from the 1850s to today. And that's important, and it's intentional because I want to point out the reproduction of these same systems and how they reproduce harm, right? And so you have this permanent enshrinement of individuals who are exploited and are vulnerable to this exploitation on the basis of race. And this is just a small graphic from 1989 showing to 2016. And the net worth, the median net worth by race and ethnicity. And we probably didn't think that it was this bad. And statistics show and studies show that we actually perceive Black and white wealth to be similar, and it's not. You'll see above here where we see perceived wealth or access to wealth, and what it actually is far below. And so you see from the 60s to 2016, there is not much of a shift or change. And this isn't something that I'm sure people don't endorse, right? Individuals don't want to see this happen, but this is what systems are reproducing. And this is ultimately what racialized capitalism is doing. It is a consistent de-investing and intentionally not investing in the Black community and in communities of color. And I'll say this, I know I'm approaching 10 minutes, so I'll say this, and then that'll be my final piece is the lack of class mobility. It's not class mobility, it's class chastity. If it was class mobility, which is what capitalism promotes, we wouldn't see numbers like this. you see that there's a stagnation on the account of race and income and equality. And so if you're never clearing $40,000 and your grandparents never cleared $40,000, there is no space for transition of wealth. There's no space for, you know, having the foundation to start building wealth or start building towards better economic opportunities. And that is all I have today. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate your engagement. If you have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. If there are people that would like to ask questions, could you put them in the chat? If you don't, I of course would have questions, Cameron. But I would like to first see whether there's anyone who would like to put a question in the chat. Anyone listening? Well, so then why don't I start off, and then maybe someone's going to put a question in the chat. So I guess my one question would be, so you're speaking about the problem of racial capitalism. But is there a further problem about capitalism altogether? Or is it that once the capitalism wouldn't be racialized, we're home free? I mean, I sometimes worry about this because we talk about integrating people into systems so that, you know, the problem seems to be they're not in those systems, but once they're in those systems, they're part of a capitalism, which is intrinsically imperialist. And so in order for them to do well, this means the exploitation of other people around the planet, probably Black and brown for the most part. So what, could you tell me what you think about this?
Because it's a great question. What we're seeing is that these isms, we're seeing race, we're seeing class, we're seeing being a member of the LGBT community, being a woman identifying person, any form of inequality or any form of social isms that we're seeing is a basis for discrimination. And this isn't a speculation. This is statistically speaking, we're seeing that any form of inequality is an enshrinement of capitalism and inherently unequal treatment. And in racial capitalism and in gendered capitalism and in any form in which we operate with this system, we see that individuals are not given the fair competitive chance that is being prescribed or being talked about or indoctrinated. It's more so we have a group of people that are vulnerable, many of us vulnerable, who not being able to see this transition of class, transition of wealth, and it only operates on the back and on the front of work and labor of these same vulnerable people. So there has to be a transition, because even if you start including individuals in this, there's inherently always going to be another class or another group of vulnerable people that find themselves on the front of this end, finding themselves going without homeownership, finding themselves going without ability to make rent. Most people spend, I think 25% of Americans spend at least 65% of their income or more than 60% of their income on rent. It doesn't matter who is on the receiving end of that. It's inherently, unequal, unethical that people can't pursue, the right to liberty and happiness because of this system. So I think that's my best, jab at answering that question. But it's a great question. Something else must come, because this is not working for the great majority of us.
Thank you for that. I still don't see questions in the chat. Do either one of your colleagues, one of your peers have a question? Maybe Grace has a question, or maybe Elena Blackwelder has a question for you. I mean, you don't have to, but if you do have a question.
First of all,
Oh,
Cameron.
so wait a minute. Someone named Luis has a question. I'm sorry. I just want to get the other people out there. So Luis, to everyone, I do have a question. That's what he
Hi,
says.
can I
So, oh,
ask?
there you are. Okay.
So first of all, congratulations. That was a very good presentation. But I would also like to ask about something that ties in with Dr. Johns was saying. Do you think that we tend to compartmentalize all of these different struggles into different things instead of actually seeing them as connected things? We kind of don't take a materialistic approach to it and end up thinking about, oh, so the LGBTQ struggle is one thing and it's completely isolated from every single other struggle, which is different from the, immigrants' rights struggle or the racial equality struggle, and we tend to separate all of those things. So my question would be, if you think that we're in which direction we're going. You think people have been tending to separate those things, or more and more bring them together and understanding that they all are part of the same struggle?
Right. Thank you for that question. It's a great question. I think that we have a really bad case of individual, a really big issue regarding seeing things as only pertaining to ourselves or not. And we also think oftentimes that these community struggles are just that, just struggles that deal with issues within our community. And sometimes we don't have the lens to view other struggles as similar, because the oppression isn't always something that we can or we have our own personal prejudice why we don't want to see that wovenness, that intersectionality between struggle and issue. And like I think just what you're saying, there is very much interconnectedness in everything. It is a matter of being willing to be patient and sit there and figure out what it is, or at least to be bold enough to look at it for what it is. We have don't always like to acknowledge those, and to see that interconnectedness. So I think for certainly that everything is connected. It is a matter of recognition. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Did you want to ask your question, Graceful?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you, Cameron. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for your time. But I wanted to ask, I know we're talking about the variety of ways in which the effects of racialized capitalism are seen, not only academically. You spoke about the Head Start, I guess, or I guess the lack of a Head Start that Black students get. But I wanted to ask something that I suppose I'm a little more interested in is, how do you see this come up in terms of access to food, if you know anything about that, in terms of that effect of racialized capitalism?
Black people, and we would love to talk about food apartheid. I'll definitely be talking about that there as well, because that is a great point. You have these communities that don't have access to clean food, affordable food that is good for their bodies, and are grossly undernourished, and don't have access to anything else other than fast foods, because you don't have a grocery store for a mile or beyond radius. And that is, there's a reason why there's no Whole Foods in a lot of these underserved communities. There's barely even a Walmart in a lot of these underserved communities. We don't have Fresh Market in the hood. That's just not something that we do, because we're intentional about who we give food to. And that is a really intrinsic part of racial capitalism, and later today I'll argue of genocide, making the physical well-being and mental well-being of a group of people and just completely out of the way, out of the option, because you don't access to clean food, be safe traveling. You're in a space where you are 75% more likely to live near a hazardous plant. Like, you are ingesting waste intentionally and unintentionally, and there's nothing that you can do about it because that is how systems are impeding themselves. You know, that's a great question, and it's certainly a big problem, especially in Greensboro and Gulf County.
Thank you very much, Cameron. I have a feeling, although I don't see someone telling me to end, maybe they're going to do that now. I am going to end it because I see it's 11:21 and this session ends at 11:50. So I'm thinking we should probably move on to the next person, but that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And so we're going to move on to the next person, who is Elena Blackwelder. Okay. So let me read Elena Blackwelder's bio. Elena Blackwelder is part of the class of 2023 at Meredith College and has been a member of the honors program since her freshman year. She has presented research on the effects of an affective education at conferences nationwide and has also presented her current research at the Pop Culture Association in the South. As a student, she is active in student government, Ethics Bowl, and Service Scholars. Okay, so thank you, Elena.
Let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see that? All good? Okay. So yes, my name's Elena Blackwelder. I'm from Meredith College, and I'll be presenting my research on white women in the civil rights. The sisters were only in it for themselves. To start off, we know that most students in America are given a rudimentary set of knowledge on which to have their conversations on race, feminism, and current political news. In civics classrooms, they're taught that America did have flaws, but the power of the people had led to a significant change so that all citizens could live in peace and harmony, which would help us achieve the American dream. When it comes to the civil rights movement, a curriculum might include that the movement was initiated as a method of gaining rights for Black American citizens. After slavery and Reconstruction, Black people still did not have equal and equitable access to jobs, housing, education, and other necessary aspects of life. There were protests led by people such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and John Lewis, but these protests included people of all races and backgrounds. The movement consisted of marches, boycotts, and occasionally violence in order to bring awareness to the cause. And then civil rights activism mostly took place in the mid-20th century and ended when its goals were achieved by legislation. Now, what this mainstream or master narrative fails to adequately address and reflect are the specific iniquities of the civil rights movement and the ongoing struggle for equity and access, as well as the significant roles of women in achieving justice for Black Americans. It also does not adequately demonstrate the reaches of white resistance and how political leaders failed to act or even went so far as to prevent changing attitudes and policy. Now, furthermore, women also played a significant role in the success of the civil rights movement and in the ongoing activism that we see today, but they don't receive the same acclaim as men. Rosa Parks is praised for giving up her, or refusing to give up her bus seat, but her legal work protecting Black women from gang rape and advocating for justice is often forgotten or altogether ignored. Fannie Lou Hamer was a revolutionary for Black voting rights and eventually became the co-founder of the Freedom Democratic Party. But when you ask a room full of college students who she is, a mere handful will be able to respond. Ella Baker was one of the primary leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but is relegated to the background in favor of the boldness of John Lewis. While the men of the civil rights movement certainly deserve their recognition, the master narrative actively works to minimize the role of strong Black women. Now, what we also see is that many white feminists fail to acknowledge how women of color, particularly Black women, were put at a further disadvantage by the intersection of racism and misogyny in political, social, and economic settings. It's because of this void on discourse of intersectionality and the plights of Black women, especially in the wake of white feminism, that Black women developed their own academic and political ideology, which is womanism. Where the civil rights movement pushed Black women to the background and emphasized their secretarial work, feminism focused on legal solutions and struggles of white women alone. Womanism has taken on the burden of Black women and other women of color by highlighting how oppression can come from multiple sources. Alice Walker was one of the primary developers of this ideology, and it was expanded upon by scholars such as Bell Hooks, Katie Cannon, and Miki Kendall. In typical scholarship, according to Bell Hooks, quote, "The racial imperialism of whites has supported the custom of scholars using the term women, even if they are referring solely to the experience of white women." Now, Black women have been indoctrinated not to fight against the systems oppressing them for multiple identities, and were taught that, quote, "their interests were not worth fighting for," to believe that the only options available to them were submission to the terms of others. Womanism works to identify these gaps in literature and policy and advocate for equity that acknowledges and includes women of color. Today, we see that America claims to value diversity and different experiences, and people like to brag about how diverse their social groups are. If someone is called out for biased statements or actions, a well-known defense is, "Well, I have a Black friend." For women, conversations about feminism and equality may focus on wage gaps or domestic violence, but they fail to recognize how those statistics become even larger for women of color. The question then is, and the question of this research is, can friendships truly be formed between people, particularly women of different races and backgrounds, when social and political understandings are so different? Aristotle would tell us no. The perfect friendship theoretically is, quote, "made up of people who are good and alike in virtue, for each alike wishes well to another." One cannot advocate for other interests beside their own in good faith or without ulterior motives. This is the case for interracial friendships, especially those between women. White women are so absorbed in their own advancement and in the issues that they face that it is difficult or impossible for them to adequately advocate for women of color, even those that they consider to be their friends. Miki Kendall, in her book Hood Feminism, identifies one notable instance in which it was shown how pervasive this issue is in white feminism, which was the 2016 presidential election. When Donald Trump won the election over Hillary Clinton, it became clear that white women were to thank, surprising other white women who could not fathom why. Kendall stated that the shock that 53% of white women who voted for Trump was sadly hilarious. What white women proved so clearly was that their interests were aligned with the white men who seemingly protected them from communities of color. White women were so determined to prevent people of color, especially women, from gaining privilege in America that they were willing to even vote against their own interests. Aristotle's theory proved correct. True friendship cannot be developed when interests clash. Despite these conflicts, popular culture does tell us that people believe that race relations have never been better. Minorities represent roughly 40% of the population and 35% of leading roles in television. At the executive level, though, only 10.3% of show creators were not white. What media often does not depict is the impact that critical conversations about race and equity can have on women of color, as well as other members of their communities. Black women often take on the questions that their white friends have about race, politics, beauty, and more, and they are expected to be the ultimate resource. This can lead women of color to developing depression or social anxiety when they are surrounded by white women who do not understand nor try to learn about the experiences of women of color. The narrative seen in media then is creating unrealistic expectations for how interracial friendships and relationships actually work in real life. First, I want to focus on one media called The Long Walk Home, which was set during the Montgomery bus boycotts and follows the story of Odessa Carter, who is a nanny for Miriam Thompson and decides to participate in the boycotts and speak out against the unequal treatment of Black citizens. Miriam was against this and decided that she would personally drive Odessa to work every day rather than let her walk back and forth and be late or have to leave early. This decision was not made out of a sense of decency or morality, but because Miriam thought that the bus boycott was harming her family's quality of life. As the plot progresses, though, Miriam learns more about herself, her community, and the civil rights movement. And the audience is expected to give her some leniency because of how she has been raised and because of how far she comes. Now, as Odessa fights for racial justice, Miriam is having her own feminist realizations outside of the civil rights movement, focusing on how the men in her life have confined her perspectives and how her life too is ruled by a misogynistic system. The Long White Walk Home highlights a form of white feminism in which white women get involved in activism when they see how they are personally impacted. While it might be more realistic to interracial female interactions, the film does not provide a friendship example for which to strive. Next, we have The Help, which is one of the most well-known movies depicting interracial female friendship and how it can create peace. Based on the 2009 book with the same name, this movie tells the story of a white woman living in Mississippi in the 1960s who wants to be a writer. When she returns home from college, Skeeter decides to interview Black women who work as nannies or maids for white families in the town. Skeeter works with a woman named Aibileen to encourage other women to come forward and share their stories. The narrative that the movie ultimately tells us is that a white woman who provides a platform to Black women in her community so that they could all work together to heal. Although The Help had been a fan favorite for several years, it recently came under criticism for its sorely mistaken depiction of interracial feminism. One of the most prominent criticisms of the film came from Viola Davis herself, who said that she regretted taking on the role of Aibileen and being a part of the production. She said that at the end of the day, it wasn't the voices of the maids that were heard. She knows Aibileen, she knows Minnie, they're her grandmother, they're her mom. And she wanted people to know what it felt like working in the 1960s, and she wanted to hear how you really felt about it. She never had that working in the movie. Skeeter is a classic depiction of a politically conscious white woman and a character built to make liberal white feminists feel good about themselves. However, she did very little real work to help the Black women in her community and provide them with methods of economic and political support. The Help actively reinforces this narrative and these stereotypes of white women, liberal white feminists, by minimizing the voices of Black female characters and instead prioritizing white saviorism. Next, in recent years, the friendship between women, a sisterhood, has been lauded as an essential support system for women throughout their lives. In The Sister in Traveling Pants, although it's not a commentary on the patriarchy, it provides a feel-good depiction of an essential female friendship in the formative years. Now, Carmen goes to visit her father and discovers that he is engaged to a new woman. Carmen is Latina and is surprised and hurt to find out that this woman is a white woman. She feels betrayed and has to work through the subsequent events without the support of her friends, because her friends Bridget, Tibby, and Lena are all white and cannot understand how she feels this betrayal and conflict within herself. The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants depicts something similar to the words of a film critic named Wesley Morris, who states that, quote, "For people of color, some aspect of friendship with white people involves an awareness that you could be dropped through a trapdoor of racism at any moment." Now, despite the fact that this movie ends with the four friends happily telling each other stories about their summer adventures, Carmen has still had an experience that her friends cannot relate to and did not try to empathize with, and she did not have the perfect Aristotelian friendship. Finally, The Little Fires Everywhere is a more recent Hulu series that received much acclaim. And the novel and show are very similar in plot and investigates how two families, the Richardsons and the Warrens, become intertwined. Now, in the book, Mia and Pearl Warren did not have their race specified, but a significant portion of their story on television is seen in the context of their identities as Black women. Mrs. Richardson, who rents an apartment to the Warrens, sees herself as a politically conscious white woman who does everything she can to be charitable. Yet at the start of the show, she is seen calling the police on Mia and Pearl loitering in their car in the local parking lot. Now, although Mia is initially offended by the actions of Mrs. Richardson, she eventually takes the offer to work at her house. That way she can keep an eye on Pearl. At times, it seems like the two women might become friends through their shared experiences with misogyny, but race and socioeconomic status continue to get in the way. What Little Fires Everywhere does really well is depicting an interracial female friendship in which the white woman sees herself as politically conscious, but the Black woman refuses to accept the bare minimum that would place the mental burden on herself. Mrs. Richardson takes this as a personal affront, but it is all too common for society to place the responsibility for friendship and education on Black women rather than expecting white women to do and be better. Now, Mike Hale of the New York Times saw Reese Witherspoon's depiction of Mrs. Richardson as, quote, almost cartoonish, and described the show's characters as a moral and cultural equation. This critique falls flat, though, when one really considers how these real-life interactions occur time and time again. Each of these productions takes on a really difficult question of how women of different races interact, support each other, and how they could even be friends. If Aristotle said that true, perfect friendship was not possible in the face of conflicting social and political goals, then the characters presented were to either confirm or deny this thesis. The Long Walk Home and Little Fires Everywhere more accurately portray the difficulties that women in interracial friendships face and highlight how white women, even those who see themselves as politically conscious, are working in their own self-interest. Countering this, though, The Help and the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants paint a much happier picture of interracial female friendship, emphasizing how love and happiness can overcome socioeconomic differences in order to create a more peaceful sisterhood. Each of these two depictions, though, cannot exist in a vacuum, and society requires that we see the juxtaposition between conflict and harmony in friendships in order to learn how to be better allies. White women cannot continue to work solely from a place of self-interest or charity, but we must also do the work to understand how our privilege has historically led to the oppression of our sisters in this sisterhood. Popular media is a good place to start with these lessons, but it cannot be the resolution that we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena Blackwelder. We only have time for one question, I think, because otherwise we will run out of time. So do we have one question from anyone? Let me see in the chat, or anyone in the room. Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat. Is there anyone in the room who would like to raise a hand? Otherwise, I will ask a question. I always have a question to ask, but oh, here's one question, Paige Turner. Okay, thank you.
Hi. I was wondering if how this research changed your perspective going forward. What are some things that you approach differently after investigating these topics?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think so I go to Meredith, which is a historically women's college. And so we've had a lot of conflict in the past couple of years in the wake of summer of 2020, George Floyd's death, Breonna Taylor's death, in trying to resolve the racial tensions on campus and kind of acknowledge how our history as a predominantly white institution can also play into our sisterhood. And so I think that doing this research kind of allowed me to explore the either solutions to this tension or explore how myself and my friends can be more of a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem. And so when reviewing interracial female friendship, it's so important to keep in mind how you either play into that narrative and can actively critically think about your own actions, your own role in this system, or you can kind of back away from it and take a more passive role. And so I think that this allowed me to think critically, be active in my education and in others' education. And so it allowed me to apply this to a real life experience that is happening and continues to happen on Meredith's campus. And I also do see a second question in the chat about what surprised me most.
I do as well, but you know what? We are at 11:39 and this session ends at 11:50. So I can't, I'm sorry, I just have to move on to the next person. So that I think Grace Wall even said she's going to be a little bit long. So I just have to move on. I'm sorry about that. So let's go ahead. Grace Wall is a junior majoring in human development and family studies with minors in psychology and African American diaspora studies. She is pursuing full university honors in Lloyd International Honors College as a Reynolds Scholar. So take it away, Grace. Oh, thank you.
All right, can everyone see my screen? Yes, okay. So thank you, Dr. Jones, for that introduction. Today, in the interest of time, I will try to keep it short so we can all get out by 11:50, but I will be presenting on how colorblind racism shows up in the ways in which white parents teach their white children to understand race. So really quickly, like the name implies, colorblind racism is an approach to understanding race that does not see or acknowledge race as being something of significance in determining social opportunities and outcomes, but also not seeing it as something of cultural and emotional importance. In terms of white parents utilizing this approach to understanding race, it's often not ill-intentioned, although the real life implications are certainly racist. It's sort of that idea of, well, if I don't see color, then I can't discriminate based on color. But in reality, no matter how many times a white person says, I don't see color, the reality of the situation is that we do from the earliest stages of our development. So at 3 months old, babies begin to prefer races from their own racial group. So somewhere in the first 3 months of life, this behavior is learned. It is not present in newborns, it's not present in 1 month olds, but it's learned. At 9 months, babies can categorize faces, and even at 9 months, we can see differences in the ways in which white children perceive race from the ways in which children of color perceive race. At 36 months, children often demonstrate in all racial groups in-group favoritism. This is natural, this is normal, this is something that we see in all species, all organisms. But in white children, the levels of in-group favoritism are especially high, and there are pattern-seeking behaviors of choosing same race friends in white children at this age that we don't see at comparative levels in other race children. And even at 36 months, we can see that white children consistently have anti-Black biases. So in the first 3 years of life, the ways in which children understand race has developed in significant ways. At 3 to 4 years, which is when scholars tend to agree that racial perceptions develop, quote, meaningfully, non-Black children consistently demonstrate associations between negative emotionality, such as anger, with Blackness, but particularly this is apparent in white children. By 5 and 6 years old, white children demonstrate high levels of anti-Blackness. In an American context, in Canadian context, we also see high levels of anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous, beliefs in this age group. And then out-group prejudice, which goes along with in-group favoritism, can be measured at statistically significant levels. This sounds a little clinical, but what this means is that white children at 5 and 6 years old are not only actively dismissing and not acknowledging their peers of color, but are actively discriminating, even at this young age. Of course, in a child setting, but it is discrimination nonetheless. And then in 7, 8, 9 years old, children begin to explicitly and frequently talk about race, even though up until this point, it's largely something that has not been explicitly discussed with them, because white parents on average do not believe that their children are capable of understanding concepts such as race, and therefore delay these conversations until 5 or 6 years old on average. So lots and lots of racial development has happened up until this point in white children, but parents are not beginning these explicit conversations until, as we saw in the previous slide, high levels of anti-Blackness are found, high levels of outgroup prejudice, and that's when white parents begin to have these explicit conversations. Unfortunately, up until this point, we know that the bulk of white childhood racial socialization lies in the hands of the media, which is full of racist images, racist messages, racist tropes. I won't get into most of the stuff on the screen, but on the left, we see Black-coded characters that are depicted as lazy and conniving. We've got Sambo-like characters in shows meant for children and adolescents consumption. We've got stereotypes of the magical Black person and the depiction of voodoo that's sensationalized. We've got the magical Asian character and Karate Kid, as well as extremely racist depictions of Indigenous folks and family favorite films like Peter Pan and The Road to El Dorado. We also see that this implicit racial socialization happens in the ways in which white children are listening to other people talk. So again, colorblind racists say, I don't see color, I don't consider race, but in reality they do. And when we are talking about things that are political, even if you're not explicitly mentioning race, it is going to be racialized. So children are listening to this language being used around them, this racially coded language. We can think of a former president who said on national television, referred to an entire group of people as thugs. We know who he was talking about. That is racially coded language. When we hear people talking about government handouts and criticizing folks on welfare, they're not talking about people like me. They're not talking about people in my family. That's racially coded language. And even in recent years, the word immigrant, which is inherently not a racial term, is racialized and often spoken of in a negative light. We're not talking about European immigrants when we're talking about, quote, the immigration problem. We're not talking about Canadian immigrants. It is racialized. And children are picking up on the social nuances that come along with this implicit racial socialization. So when explicit racial socialization begins late in the game, again, at 5 and 6 years old, white parents are not doing much to combat the racist messages that children have already picked up on and absorbed. White parents report high levels of discomfort in speaking with their children about race. Again, it happens at 5 or 6 years old. That is extremely developmentally delayed. Children have already developed biases and prejudices. And when white parents begin this racial socialization late in the game explicitly, it's not comprehensive and it's often censored and, again, colorblind. So things like, we're all the same on the inside. Color doesn't matter. That MLK quote that people love to take out of context. We want to judge people by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. I saw this in my own childhood, racial socialization. And I don't have time to go too far into this anecdote, but you can see, and we do see constantly, that white parents often feel proud of themselves for adopting this colorblind ideology. They feel proud of themselves when their children don't see color in meaningful ways. In the interest of time, I will skip past some of the central linguistic and rhetorical strategies that we see in colorblind racism, but I strongly recommend reading the book by sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva entitled Racism Without Racists. He does a great job of breaking down the different linguistic strategies and rhetorical strategies that we see. I will go ahead and say, just going back to something that Elena brought up in her presentation, the use of discursive buffers is, well, I'm not Black, I don't have this experience, or something that Elena mentioned in her presentation, well, I have a Black friend, therefore I'm qualified to speak on this. That is an extremely common thing that we see in discussions that utilize a colorblind racist approach. And again, in Cameron's presentation, we talked about the ways in which racial capitalism manifests, and we use the same map, so look at us. But white parents are seeking segregation. They're choosing the schools. They have the privilege of choosing the schools in the neighborhoods that they live in a lot of times. And they talk about them, again, in racially coded language. We're choosing a better school that's better than the alternatives being dangerous, which is a racially coded word, right? Because when white parents are saying they're moving away from dangerous neighborhoods, we know what kind of neighborhoods they're talking about, and their children do too. And they're picking up on these things. So they're creating predominantly white circles for their children to live and learn in, which again is doing little to combat the racist messages, and in fact is contributing to the racism that these white children are learning. A color conscious approach can be adopted by parents. You would hope that this is one of those things that parents would just know. You would hope that this would be a common sense thing. Unfortunately, it's not. But, Cameron in his presentation was talking about systems that contribute to the reproduction of inequality. And families are social systems. Families contribute to the reproduction of inequality. And the ways in which white parents teach their children to understand race is one of those ways that we contribute to the reproduction of inequality. But there are other ways to discuss race within white families. It encourages the development of empathy, self-exploration, and anti-racism to have conversations that explicitly acknowledge race, the importance of race in social contexts, in cultural contexts, emotional contexts, the ways in which it affects financial, academic, environmental opportunities and outcomes. recognizing racism and privilege. And we see that when parents adopt a color conscious approach, when they seek out diverse communities to live in, they seek out diverse schools for their children to go to, we see that children as young as 5 years old are noticing, I don't want to say small instances, but maybe like flippant comments or like passive things that their teachers will do in class. White children as young as 5 years old, when they are socialized to understand race in a color conscious way, are able to recognize the smaller ways in which racism manifests in places like on the playground or in classroom settings, whereas their other white peers cannot do that because of the colorblind approach that their parents have taken in socializing them. In conclusion, we see that from the earliest stages of human development, we all see race. At 3 months old, we all see race. Adopting a colorblind approach for white parents to teach their children, adopting a colorblind approach does nothing to combat the racist messages that children are seeing in the media, that they're hearing from the ways in which people around them are talking about politics, that they're seeing in the ways that their teachers are talking and interacting with students. A colorblind approach does nothing to combat these things and does everything to solidify and maintain this racial caste system that we have, the plight of racialized capitalism, right, that Cameron was speaking of. Everything that white parents are doing when they are using a colorblind approach contributes to the reproduction of inequality. This is not the only option for teaching your children to learn about race, but unfortunately, it is the most commonly used option that we see white parents utilizing and teaching their children about race. I recognize that we are over time, but I do thank you for this opportunity to speak, and I want to thank Cameron and Elena for your wonderful presentations. And thank you, Dr. Jones, for facilitating.
Thank you very much, Grace Small, for your very, very rich presentation. We are gonna, even though we're over time, I want to take one question. I think it would be great to have one question for you as well. Are there any questions there?
I have a question.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
I'll just let you speak. I can't see who it is.
It's Cameron. It's Cameron. Grace, first of all, wonderful presentation. I loved it so much. My question is, what do you think is the barrier to get parents to start talking candidly the way they're, candidly being passively, racist. So what do you think is the step to getting candid recognition of the way that we other individuals, and using more of that less kind of color blindness approach and more of a color recognition approach, a recognition of differentness, but also that's not a bad thing. It's okay, kind of ordeal.
That's a great question. Thank you. Where to begin? Because there are so many barriers, or so many aspects of society that teach us that, it's uncomfortable to talk about race, first of all, but also we've got all of these social institutions that are perpetuating this white privilege, right? Perpetuating this color blindness that we see. But something that social scientists and psychologists have researched is that the number one predictor of how parents are going to talk about race with their children and when they are going to talk about race with their children is simply understanding human development. Understanding that your children are capable of listening and learning about these things earlier than 5 and 6 years old. We also see education programs as being extremely helpful, education programs for parents, and recognizing the importance of race. I think baby steps, unfortunately, with white parents just kind of undo all of the racist socialization that they've received piece by piece. White people are just really hard-headed, as we have seen in terms of addressing their own biases and unlearning the socialization that has been racist their whole lives. But education programs on the importance of race as something that is culturally important, emotionally important, and then getting to the ways that it is, it affects our economic opportunities, right? It affects outcomes. And then teaching parents to understand the human brain, right? Because not understanding that your white kid is already learned some racist tendencies at 9 months old, and you're going to wait until 6 years old to start talking to your kid about race. So having white parents understand better how their children's brains work to kind of start having these conversations early enough to get rid of this disconnect in terms of, I guess that would soften the hard-headedness, I suppose, in children. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you. Those were wonderful presentations. And I think we are now closing the session. I don't know if that means that we just leave the room. I'm not sure how this works. We just leave the room, but thank you all very much. You're doing beautiful work, doing very important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Thank you.